Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to part one of the 7.1 lecture. The 7.1 lecture is going to be all about the age of nationalism and realpolitik. So we're looking at political history primarily from 1850 to 1871. The themes for this lecture will include national and European identity. That theme in particular is going to be very prominent all throughout Unit 7. And the other theme is states and other institutions of power, as we will be looking at a lot of political history in this lecture. Our objective for this lecture is that you will need to be able to explain the factors that resulted in German and Italian unification. The lecture will address many other topics besides German and Italian unification specifically. However, those other topics will be relevant to the unifications of Germany and Italy, respectively. But I would definitely argue that those are going to be the most important developments discussed in this lecture and in this entire section, because these developments will dramatically change the balance of power of Europe for the foreseeable future. So this first section of the lecture is titled Transitions and the Crimean War. We're going to provide some contextualization here on the first slide, just reminding all of us what had just happened in Unit 6 with the revolutions of 1848 and things like that, and then also kind of establish a roadmap of where we're headed in the post-1850 political landscape of Europe. And then we'll start talking about the Crimean War, which is a major turning point in European political history. We'll get to that on another slide. All right, for now, we are setting the stage and reminding ourselves of what life was like in Europe before 1850, and then also looking at what will happen after 1850. So before 1850, in that period especially of 1815 to about 1848, Europe was defined by this repressive conservatism. There was the Age of Metternich. It was the concert of Europe using the principle of intervention and legitimacy to crush revolutions. And after the 1848 revolutions, it appeared that the conservatives had won, and that liberalism and nationalism appeared defeated. One of the biggest reasons for this is because the middle class in the 1840s was increasingly uncomfortable with the more radical social revolutionary doctrines, right? So remember, one of the big reasons those revolutions failed is because the middle class abandoned the more radical ideologies of Republicans and the working class, and they sided with the conservatives to maintain peace and stability and ultimately maintain the status quo. However, the conservatives have not established a permanent victory, because the second half of the century will be defined as a period of war. There will be some small wars more frequently, and also a significant period of change. Liberals all over Europe are going to shift their emphasis to the goal of national unification, right? So both liberals and conservatives, honestly, are going to be focusing more on realistic politics. Are also going to be focusing more on nationalism. And what's interesting is that within 25 years, many of the goals that liberals and nationalists had in the early part of the century will come to fruition. Those goals will become a reality. Moving on to the second point. One of the other big transitions we will see is a transition from the exuberant romanticism that defined politics and culture and art. This transitions to more of a hard-headed realism. In fact, the period of 1850 to about 1870 is frequently called the Age of Realism, as realism replaces romanticism as the dominant philosophy and the dominant culture of Europe after 1850. And like romanticism, realism will be evident in politics, in art, in culture, and in literature. This realism, this culture of realism reflects the attitude of politics, and especially former revolutionaries, who are now less optimistic and more practical in their approaches, right? It's more about being practical as opposed to idealistic in achieving political goals. And so we will also see that reflected in art and literature. We'll talk about many examples of those later in this unit. And we'll also discuss how that realism is reflected in the concept of realpolitik here in just a moment. Now, realism will eventually give way after 1870 to other cultural trends that are much more irrational and much more interesting that we will discuss later in this unit as well. All right, third bullet point. The first half of the 19th century was defined by lots of economic hardship. In fact, economic struggles had been a motivating factor in the rise of early liberalism and socialism. And the early Industrial Revolution had actually exacerbated the wealth gap between the very rich and the very poor. However, this will transition into an age defined by greater prosperity. Even though continental countries had lagged behind Great Britain in the early Industrial Revolution, in the second half of the 19th century, they will fully realize their own industrial development. In addition, the second half of the 19th century will see significant new scientific and technological developments in areas such as engineering, urbanization, medicine, and militarization. And overall, this will improve the standard of living for everyone, not just the upper and upper middle class. So the new organizing principle that will really come to define European politics and culture and life is nationalism. Nationalism is the name of the game from about 1848 to 1914. Nationalism proves to be the most powerful force to emerge in the modern era. It is capable of containing the many challenges presented by the French Revolution and the many challenges presented by the Industrial Revolution. So nationalism emphasizes loyalty to the nation first and foremost, but this loyalty could be manifested in a variety of ways. We could see it in romantic idealism, in liberal reform, in political unification, in radicalism and anti-Semitism, and also in imperialism and the justification of conquering other nations, which is another topic we'll discuss later in this unit. Nationalism was also able to appeal to the broad masses of society, and this would eventually lead to the rise of mass politics and mass culture, which we will discuss at the end of Unit 7, actually. Nationalism is what would allow for the emergence of universal male suffrage across European states. It would encourage the growth of political parties and the diversity of political beliefs. And by the end of the century, more governments were organized around this concept of nationality. And one of the most interesting things about nationalism, beyond its sheer power and influence, is that nationalism was not specific to one political side or the other. Nationalism could be manifested in a more liberal or democratic country, and it could also be manifested in conservative and fascist countries. And we'll definitely see examples of those later on. So finally, that brings me to a really important term that defines Unit 7, and that is the realpolitik. So this is a term that you'll definitely want to make sure you understand. So the realpolitik suggests a new generation of leaders, specifically usually more conservative leaders, who practice what we call the politics of reality. So it's this new generation of leaders who are practicing the politics of reality. That means they are going to accomplish their political goals through practical and pragmatic means, right? They're going to be realistic as opposed to idealistic. Therefore, the form of government for many of these leaders was actually less important than the actual economic and social realities of the day. So remember, in the first half of the century, conservatives were dead set on those legitimate monarchies and traditional institutions. Well, now conservatives are less concerned about that specific form of government, and they're more concerned about just gaining power in whatever way they can. And one of the primary ways they're going to do that is by utilizing nationalism. So really now, in the era of the realpolitik, conservatism is defined more by the desire to strengthen states and restore social order. So I'll emphasize that one more time. Conservatism used to be about traditional institutions and legitimate monarchies, right? Think that Metternich style of conservatism. But the realpolitik style of conservatism is more about the desire to strengthen states and restore social order. And these conservative leaders were willing to sometimes use liberal or even socialist ideas to further their goals and maintain their political power. The other defining element of the realpolitik is that often these nationalist goals were achieved step by step in a very Machiavellian fashion. All right, so the idea of the realpolitik is also deeply and strongly rooted in Machiavelli's approach to statecraft. So that's another important factor to understand about the realpolitik. Again, these new leaders are very practical, very pragmatic, and they will use anything and everything to achieve their political goals. So the practice of realpolitik and these leaders will be evident, especially in this 7.1 section. Realpolitik practices are going to lead to developments such as German unification, Italian unification, Hungarian autonomy. And we will meet some of the most famous realpolitik leaders as well, including Louis Napoleon, who becomes Napoleon III of France, Count Camillo de Cavour, who leads the Italian unification as the Minister of Piedmont, Sardinia, and finally, the ultimate realpolitik figure of them all, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, who orchestrates German unification and forever changes the course of European history. And don't worry, we will learn all about each one of those leaders in this lecture in a later section. For now, we're going to move on to our second topic of this first section, which is the Crimean War. So the reason we're starting out with the Crimean War is because this event is considered a turning point in the 19th century. It happens in about the mid-19th century, as you can see, 1850 to 1856. But also, it is considered a turning point because the Crimean War will destroy many of the traditional alliances that defined the Concert of Europe and the Congress of Vienna, and it will also shift the balance of power in Europe. In many ways, the Crimean War is necessary for making the political adjustments necessary for Italian and German unification later on in the century. So keep that in mind. That's its overall significance, is it will change the political landscape enough to allow for that unification later in the century. And also, it basically destroys the Concert of Europe and their sort of conservative stranglehold on the continent. Anyway, getting to the content of the slide here. The first bullet point. This is all about the Eastern question. So the Crimean War is part of this larger saga that is the decline of the Ottoman Empire. You might remember that the Ottoman Empire over here in brown on the map was a very powerful empire for much of modern European history. However, by the 19th century, it was clear that they were in a period of decline and they began to lose territory in Europe. This was probably most noticeable with the War of Greek Independence in 1830, when Greece, right down here in the Mediterranean, was able to free themselves from Ottoman rule. And beyond the War of Greek Independence, the Ottomans were gradually losing more and more territory to Russia. However, as the Ottoman Empire declined, many European states, not just Russia, were wondering how they may benefit from the disintegration of this empire. And as a result, this encouraged the nations of Europe to realign, right, to develop new alliances and to become more suspicious of each other. And they would ultimately ignore the concerns of other major powers and focus more on their own national interests. And that actually introduces a significant political theme for the next 70 years, that nations are going to be primarily concerned about their own national interests and not the bigger picture, which is a significant difference from the attitude of the Concert of Europe under Metternich. Also, the Concert of Europe's credibility had been undermined by the failure of the great powers to cooperate during the revolutions of 1848 to 1849, because it demonstrated that the Concert of Europe was no longer able to control the politics of the European continent. Moving on to the second bullet point. Specifically, Russia, Austria, and Great Britain were really interested in the political and economic opportunities presented by the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. Russia wanted to expand their sphere of influence and control, especially in the Black Sea, which is right over here, and the Mediterranean region. Austria wanted more territory in the Balkans. The Balkans are this peninsula right here. Austria already controlled a lot of territory in the northern Balkans, and they were interested in expanding further into the Balkans. And what's interesting is this would eventually lead to some inevitable conflict between Austria and Russia. More on that later. And France and Great Britain, despite being Western European countries, were interested in the commercial opportunities presented in the Eastern Mediterranean that might come with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, specifically trade, colonization, things like that. So, moving on to the third bullet point here. What was the immediate cause of the war? The first two bullet points I discussed were more of the long-term causes of the war, and then now we're going to look more closely at the short-term or immediate cause of the war. So the short-term major cause of the war was a dispute between two groups of Christians over privileges in the Holy Land. So the Holy Land is modern-day Israel, Palestine over here in the far eastern Mediterranean. And this was a territory that was controlled by the Ottoman Turks, although the Ottoman Turks allowed Christians to have shrines in this Holy Land, and they also allowed Christian groups to exist in the Holy Land. So in 1852, the Turks, who, as I mentioned, controlled Palestine, agreed to Napoleon III's demands to provide enclaves in the Holy Lands for the protection of Roman Catholic religious orders. So essentially, Napoleon III, who is the Emperor of France currently, demanded that there be more protection for Roman Catholics, and France wanted more access to the Holy Land. However, this agreement seemed to jeopardize existing agreements which provided access to Greek Orthodox religious orders, which is, of course, what Russia favored. So France is traditionally Roman Catholic, so they want to protect the Roman Catholics in Palestine, whereas Russia wants to protect and favor the Greek Orthodox. In response to this perceived slight by the Ottoman Turks, the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, ordered Russian troops to occupy several Turkish-controlled regions on the Danube River. So the Danube River is over here kind of in Eastern Europe. It goes a little bit through the Balkans. And so Russia is going to go and occupy territory there that is held by the Turks because Russia is trying to control the Danube River, which is a major river in Europe and therefore has a lot of economic value. Russia claimed that it would only withdraw once the Turks had guaranteed rights for Orthodox Christians and restored Russia's privileges in the Holy Land. Now, if none of that really makes sense to you, don't worry too much about it. Basically, it's a conflict over control in the Holy Land. Frankly, it was just a pretense for the larger war and the larger political and economic issues for these big countries, Russia, Austria, Britain, France, etc. So the Ottoman Empire and Russia declare war against each other in October of 1853. These wars between the Turks and the Russians were frankly a common occurrence, and this declaration of war was pretty much inevitable because Nicholas I refused to withdraw Russian troops from the Danube provinces. So that was nothing out of the ordinary. Russia and the Ottomans fight frequently. However, the big surprise came in 1854 when Britain and France declared war against Russia, right? They joined the side of the Ottoman Turks instead of Russia. And this was a major surprise to some people because, of course, the Ottoman Turks are not Christians, yet they are supported by Britain and France, who were Christian countries. So you may be wondering to yourself, why would Britain and France side with the Turks instead of Russia? Well, the big issue was the concern over upsetting the balance of power. Russia has a reputation of being this huge, powerful country, right? And if Russia was able to take over the Ottoman territory, especially in the Danube or in parts of the Mediterranean and Black Sea, this could dramatically upset the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Specifically, it could challenge Britain's naval control of the Eastern Mediterranean. So Britain joined specifically to protect their maritime interests in the Eastern Mediterranean and to prevent Russia from becoming too powerful. And France joined because Napoleon felt insulted by Russia, right? That Russia had tried to push France's control out of the Holy Land. But also Napoleon, like Britain, feared Russia's size and Russia's growing influence. Now, you may remember from Unit 6 that Russia and Austria had a traditional alliance, right? Russia and Austria had been best buds, especially in the days of Metternich. I remember Metternich and Nicholas I would go around together, crushing revolutions and destroying the hopes of dreams of liberals and nationalists all across Europe. So naturally, Russia turns to Austria in this war and expects them to come and help because Austria is Russia's traditional ally. However, Austria does not join the war and they will remain neutral. And this is actually a really, really big deal because Russia is now very, very upset. This is the ultimate betrayal by Austria. This is the most dramatic breakup of the mid-19th century. There's no more alliance between Russia and Austria. They are now adversaries. Austria's argument for backing out of this alliance was that they were still recovering from the revolutions of 1848 and 1849, which did have profound effects on the Austrian Empire, but also there were likely other issues at play. Austria may have also feared Russia's growing influence, for example. But like I said, there are long-term consequences to this breakup because Austria and Russia will basically never reestablish a strong political alliance again, and that's going to have implications in, say, World War I. But more on that later. Overall, the Crimean War was long, it was inefficient, it was very costly, both in terms of economic cost, and human life. The Crimean War gets its name because it was fought primarily on the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. So if we go back, you can see this area, this little box here, that is the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. The Crimean War is not a very well done war. A lot of the military maneuvers were often poorly planned. A lot of the charges of various military brigades were considered suicidal in their effort. And one of the enrichment videos that goes along with section 7.1 is going to be a little information about the charge of the British Light Brigade, which is one of the most tragic moments of the Crimean War. So you're welcome to watch that video as well for a little bit of enrichment on the Crimean War. The Crimean War had fairly high casualties. About 250,000 soldiers died. But what's interesting is that more soldiers died from disease, such as cholera, rather than their combat wounds. And this is why the presence of nurses became really significant in the Crimean War. So this brings us to our third bullet point here. One of the other significant elements of the Crimean War is that it introduced new trends in warfare, such as nurses in the battlefield, specifically Florence Nightingale, and also journalists that covered the war and reported events back to their home countries. So the Crimean War was the first war where women served as nurses in the battlefields, basically. And Florence Nightingale is this pioneer woman in nursing, and she is the person who really makes nursing an acceptable profession for women. And she establishes a lot of the most basic practices and values for nursing. Florence Nightingale was so influential and important in the Crimean War. She worked for the British, by the way. She implemented hygienic practices in the battlefield hospitals that saved lives, such as making sure areas were clean and there wasn't like blood and feces and urine all over the hospital floor, right? Doing things to prevent infection as well, doing things to prevent the spread of disease, like making sure troops had clean drinking water. Some really, really critical hygienic developments that saved many, many lives. After the war, Florence Nightingale started nursing schools back in London, and these nursing schools were widely imitated in other countries. And ultimately, like I said, Florence Nightingale legitimized nursing as a suitable profession for women. And she really is considered this pioneer in nursing and a really significant figure in that field. Also, this was the first war that was covered by journalists. And the reason for this is because of the telegraph. So the new telegraph allowed messages to be communicated more quickly from the battlefields and the front back to the home countries. This is also the first war that had even some photography. In fact, this picture on the upper picture is a photograph from the Crimean War, one of the earliest ones that we have. So the Crimean War ended in 1856 with a peace treaty called the Peace of Paris. And the outcomes of the Crimean War are probably more important than the war itself, to be honest, because the Crimean War is going to produce some dramatic changes to the balance of power in Europe. So first of all, the Black Sea was agreed to be neutral territory. All right, so no one country would be able to control the Black Sea as a body of water. And also, in this war, Russia was totally defeated. All right, so this war is a victory for the British and the French and the Ottomans and a huge loss for Russia. Russia was weak and humiliated now as the biggest loser. They had to give up all their territory and the trade that they controlled along the Danube River. They had to give up some of their territory in the area that is modern Romania. They had to withdraw from Palestine and renounce their role as the protector of the Greek Orthodox residents of the Ottoman Empire. And ultimately, the war had shattered this image of an invincible Russia, right? And Russia is so humiliated by this defeat that they will essentially withdraw from European affairs for the next 2 decades. They recognized that their technological and their military inferiority is what caused this embarrassing defeat. And so, by withdrawing from European affairs, they're able to focus more on reform and modernization and industrialization. Although we will see that because this begins so late, they will continue to be very behind the rest of Europe. All right, so Russia loses, they're going to withdraw. But also, more importantly, as I mentioned earlier, Austria and Russia are now enemies, right? They are totally enemies. And this essentially destroyed the concert of Europe and all of those old alliances that had been established at the Congress of Vienna. And with Austria and Russia now broken up, that was one of the more powerful conservative alliances that had prevented revolutions and unifications and things like that. So that essentially opened the door for this new era in politics, right? There's no more concert of Europe, there's no more Metternich, there's no more conservative alliance. So now things can start to happen. And also, we will see that Prussia was growing increasingly frustrated with Austria's domination of German politics. So now, because this alliance is broken and the Congress of Vienna and the concert of Europe is no more, Prussia realizes that it has the opportunity to potentially challenge Austria for control of the German unification, for the German Confederation, which will lead eventually to German Confederation. Unification, which we will discuss in a later section. But this concludes the lecture for section 1 of 7.1. Please stay tuned for section 2.